We're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Wendy Chang, Liberty Hills Champions Chair, and I'm so thrilled to see all of you. And what a great way to kick off the weekend as well as the holiday season of thanks. I was just mentioning prior that in 2016, we held this brunch the weekend right after the election. And while stunned, there was a great deal of comfort in being in this community. So today, while we have hope again in time, there is times of unprecedented social, health, and economic challenges. So while most of philanthropy is now rethinking their approach to giving and shifting to curb inequality, Liberty Hill has been there and our collective commitment remains. What is at the forefront now is what has been at the forefront of Liberty Hill's Change Not Charity to combat racial, economic, and environmental justice. You've bet on the right horse. So all of you, the donor activists that make Liberty Hill's fight for equality possible, thank you for your steadfast commitment to the most vulnerable and underserved. The cost of not doing this work is too high. As usual, we have a distinguished speakers with us today, but unlike other discussions of simply election assessment and results, we delve into what we care about. What does a just reconstruction look like? How best do we continue our progress? I want to thank the Liberty Hill staff for sending us our great gift baskets. I hope many of you already received it in the mail. And for those of you that may have registered a little bit late or we didn't have a correct address, it's still on your way to you. But I hope you can all enjoy your coffee and goodies that was sent to you. So let's begin. Always a pleasure to turn the spotlight on our CEO, Shane Goldsmith. Shane?
Hi, good morning, everyone. So good to see you all. I wish we could be together in person. Certainly would be a more celebratory event than it was 4 years ago, and would love to see you all in real life, but I'll have to settle for seeing you in little boxes on my screen. So I want to start by thanking Wendy. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank our board members, John and Paula, for helping us put together this event, as well as our entire board of directors and our staff, and especially our advancement team for putting so much time and love into this event and sending us the super fancy little packages, which I'm enjoying my fancy coffee mug now. So I hope you all enjoy that as well. And so today, as Wendy said, we get to do a real deep dive into what happened and how do we chart the course forward. Well, so many of us on this call were donating time and money to win the most important presidential election of my lifetime. Many of us were also hustling here at home to win important local races. We at Liberty Hill launched Liberty Vote, as many of you know, with electoral grants to grassroots electoral organizing groups in honor of Gary Stewart, our beloved Gary, as well as grants directly to ballot measure campaigns locally and across California. And we also did a voter guide, and all of that just in time to influence the 2020 elections. In total, we at Liberty Hill invested over $1 million in local and statewide elections, and we're incredibly proud to serve on the steering committee for Measure J, as well as lend our very own Michelle Pritchard to the Schools and Communities First campaign. We're thrilled about the Measure J victory. So happy to see our board member, Holly Mitchell, and recent USD honoree get elected, and of course are so deeply disappointed by the loss of Schools and Communities First. As a result of these wins, and despite even the losses, we have built tremendous capacity and infrastructure across Los Angeles and California, and a proven ability to turn out unlikely voters, low-income folks, voters of color, younger voters, and engage them in between elections in the big fights to end oil drilling, to shut down youth incarceration, and to fight for a roof over every head. So win or lose, I think we have a tremendous amount to show for the work that's been done by grassroots organizers in Los Angeles to build power. And of course, the work is not done. Now we have to create a vision for a just and equitable reconstruction locally and nationally, and we have to build the united front and the power necessary to hold our elected officials accountable to making that vision a reality, all while battling Trumpism and other evils. So what I'm most interested in now is, how do we do that? How do we create that collective vision, that united front, that base of power to really achieve our vision? And how do we ensure that Los Angeles continues to be on the cutting edge and leading the way to the just future that we all envision? So I'm going to do a quick poll as we all kind of think about what's coming up next. So what are your top concerns? You can just, if you see it on the screen, you can click the one that is your top concern about the kind of current moment that we're in. I'm interested in your responses. Take a second to do that. Looks like concern across the board, but no surprise, the greatest concern is about Trumpism. So yes, I share that concern, and we will absolutely tackle that today. In fact, Deepak, who I will introduce in a minute, but I'll say now, wrote this great essay with one of my absolute heroes, Francis Fox Piven, which I think we're going to put in the chat, about what if Trump doesn't leave? Which at the time, I think that it was at the very early stage of thinking about whether that possibility, and he, I think, really framed the issue and got us all thinking. And now we're seeing, that was before anything was really happening, and now we're seeing pretty much all of his predictions come true. Terrifying, but still impressive that Deepak's so smart. So check out that article when you have a chance, and we will certainly dive into how to deal with Trumpism in the time ahead of us. So I'd like to take a moment now to watch a clip of John Lewis, who we honored at our Upton Sinclair dinner in 2018. And I thought, his remarks, of course, are always incredible, and it's just so perfect for the moment that we're in. So let's watch that for just about 1 minute.
When we were planning the March on Washington in 1963, when I was 23 years old, I had all of my hair, and a few pounds lighter, there was a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph, who was the dean of black leadership. He would say over and over again, maybe our foremothers and our forefathers all came to this great land in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And Dr. King put it another way: we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. If not, we will perish as fools. The only thing I did, I gave a little blood on that bridge in Selma on March 7, 1965. But some people gave their very lives. They gave everything they had. And we must not let death be in vain. So I close by saying, never ever give up. Never get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic, and let's get out there and vote and work so hard this year and vote like we never ever voted before to turn our nation around.
That's definitely one of the highlights of my life and my career, to get to spend time with John Lewis and hear his words, and so meaningful now. We certainly here in Los Angeles and across the nation answered his call to vote like never before. And here at Liberty Hill, we've made it our mission to get into good trouble until there's no more good trouble to get into. So grateful for Mr. Lewis's leadership and honored to carry the torch. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers of the day. We have Liz Watson, Executive Director of the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, although today she's representing the C4 Action Fund. They developed people-led, cutting-edge policy to solve the most pressing issues of our time. Previously, Liz served as the Chief Labor Counsel on the House Education and Labor Committee. She was the Executive Director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. And in 2018, she was the Democratic nominee for Congress in Southern Indiana, where coincidentally I lived and worked briefly. Well, thank you, Liz, so much for joining us. We also have Deepak Bhargava, who we've heard from over the years. He's a distinguished lecturer at the City University of New York in the School of Labor and Urban Studies, and a frequent writer for one of our favorite mags, The Nation. He started out as an organizer at Acorn a long time ago. Anyway. And he went on to spend about 2 decades as executive director of the Center for Community Change, where he supported grassroots organizers across the nation to lead campaigns around immigration reform, welfare rights, jobs, housing. And Deepak's claim to fame is that he was my very first boss in organizing over 20 years ago. So congratulations on that accomplishment, Deepak. So Deepak and Liz will chat about the election and how we move forward for about 45 minutes. And then our own John Christensen from our board will moderate the Q&A with all of you for another roughly 45 minutes. So lots of time to get to go in depth on all these issues. So you're certainly welcome to enter questions into the chat along the way as you think of them, and John will and the staff will kind of collect those and bring them back around during the Q&A, and then you can also raise your hand and share questions during the Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to Deepak and Liz.
Hey everybody, it's great to be with you, especially under these circumstances. Shane, I'm assuming that the post office didn't quite get Liz and my gift baskets here because of all the austerity the country has been through, but we know that you intend to have them delivered to us. So it's really an honor to be with this crowd, people who are doing so much to advance justice in the country. So Liz and I have known each other for a while, and we thought we would just have a conversation we have with each other informally, kind of in front of you, because we suspect many of the things we're talking to each other about, you all are trying to puzzle through and think about as well. So I thought, Liz, I might start. I looked to the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Action Fund and to you for kind of a sense of where things are and where we should be going. So I thought I'd start by asking you about 2020. 2020, what a year. I don't know about you, but I kind of sort of lost the thread right about when the murder hornets appeared. That was the point at which things kind of dissolved into a tissue for me. So I want to ask big picture, how are you doing in the midst of this? And how are folks in DC and progressive DC, the grassroots movements leaders that you work with, members of Congress that you work with, what meaning are you making of this? And yeah, what's the mood?
Well, thank you, Deepak, and thanks, Liberty Hill folks. It's fabulous to be here with all of you this afternoon on the East Coast, this morning out in California. And I am, I think, along with Liberty Hill folks, just a member of the Deepak fan club. So glad to be able to be in this conversation with Deepak and with all of you today. You know, Deepak, it's a great question. I think I, like many people, sort of have a set of conflicting emotions in this moment, right? And so the defeat, the resounding defeat, frankly, in terms of the most votes cast ever in a presidential election of Donald Trump is a very important thing. It's a thing that was delivered by a coalition of progressive voters and centrist voters who came together, right, in order to deliver what was a really important victory, and is what gives us the chance to move forward. It was also a resounding victory for organizers, right? And we know that. We know, you know, I think the most exciting thing about this moment is that it's a movement moment like nothing I've ever seen in my lifetime. So, what is going on in Georgia with Stacey Abrams and Latasha Brown and Nisei Ufot and so many other people who are leading and working in the trenches of organizations, registering voters, and frankly, in Arizona and a number of other places. And we didn't see, a win, we didn't see the same shift in Texas, but we saw shifts, right? And that kind of organizing, that kind of movement building for the long term is what I think makes me really hopeful and excited. I'm also excited that there really is so much energy behind actually trying to deliver now for people across this country who are really suffering. And then, this is also a terrible moment, a horrible moment, a 250,000 deaths to the terrible COVID pandemic, many of which could have been prevented if we had had competent leadership. And it's a horrible moment because the second most votes ever cast in an election, were cast for someone who was really trying to engineer the demise of our democracy. And so, I think y'all sort of stole my thunder here with your little poll about, what are you most concerned about Trumpism, right? The fact that Trumpism, Donald Trump is gone and he will be leaving. Trumpism is still here. And what does that mean for us as a nation in terms of the work that we have to do? And I think, while frankly, I am ecstatic that we are able to move forward, I'm also really sober about this moment that we find ourselves in and about the tremendous work that we have in front of us and on the ground. So, so thank you for asking that. And I kind of want to turn around and ask you a similar question. I know you've done a lot of thinking, a lot of writing about this cycle. So what do you think we learned? And what do you think it means for progressives in particular?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and maybe a few headlines that I draw from the cycle. The first and maybe the most important one is this is really a victory to celebrate. Authoritarians are not often beaten at the ballot box. We are in a worldwide moment of authoritarianism. Modi, Bolsonaro, Eastern Europe, everywhere around the world. And it's a huge deal. And part of the celebration for me about it is we talked in one of the Liberty Hill conferences about the need for all parts of the center and the left to come together in a united front, to at least temporarily put aside all the many differences that are very valid and legitimate we have with each other and focus on this existential threat. And I feel like all across the country, people and organizations did that. They really showed up in an extraordinary way. It could have gone otherwise. There was all this rancorous debate during the Democratic primaries and in the aftermath. And I think that's something really to honor and to celebrate. Second, I just want to underline your point that organization was the key in this go round. I knocked on doors with my partner in Philadelphia, and I did not hear any enthusiasm from anybody, nor did our canvas teams for Joe Biden, like zero, not one person. However, that Union Unite Here, grassroots organizations in Arizona and in Georgia, they were the force that made this turn out okay. And I think, to me, that's super exciting that that's kind of breaking through nationally, the understanding that the building of independent power that has a political expression is like the core, like that is now part of the currency, and that's super exciting. Third, I think we should be really cautious about drawing lessons about the electorate. So there's all this kind of pontificating about what the elections mean, and I think we don't actually fully know yet. It is clear that Black voters, Black women saved our democracy yet again. It is clear that people of color voted overwhelmingly against Trump. It is clear that there was some move among middle-class suburban voters towards Biden. And it's clear that there was some kind of massive surge towards Trump. Those things are all clear, but there's a lot we don't know below that, and I think we should hold off judgment. The fourth, totally agree with you. Trumpism isn't going anywhere. Donald Trump may not be going anywhere himself. And so I'm feeling a little bit torn about what the meaning is of the fact that 71 million people voted for him. Clearly, a lot of that is racism. Some of that is a lot of people not being seen or feeling like they're not being seen or heard by elites in the country. And that's true. It's striking. The data shows that the counties where there were the greatest COVID deaths and the greatest economic hardship went for Trump. And I think there's something in that. And then we have this toxic, misinformation, disinformation media regime that is a huge, huge problem. And the last thing is where you ended, which is we better deliver, because I think Trump 2.0 is going to be harder to contend with than Trump himself was. So lest you wallow in the celebration for too long, I think we have our work cut out for us. So let's dig in like a layer below, Liz. And the Democrats actually lost House seats after it was predicted that they would gain. Didn't gain in state legislative chambers, didn't yet pick up the Senate. So how do we explain this contradiction between Biden's win and down ticket losses or holding steady?
Thanks, Deepak. Well, first I want to, just chime in and say I agree with your thought that there's a lot of pontificating, and frankly, there's a lot we still don't know about, the way the electorate was thinking this cycle. And so, I will put out a set of thoughts, but I think there's a lot more analysis to be done by folks who think about this all day long, and I'm still, eagerly following it. First, that's to say, it is true that we picked up in 2018 a number of seats were won that rather than we, I will say Democrats picked up a number of seats in 2018, and a lot of these were that were lost were the moderate seats. Now, those were in districts that went for Trump in 2016 largely, and when we see the down ballot losses, some of them, a little more than half, I think, right now, we know are places where they voted for Trump in this cycle, and then voted for a Republican House member. So in other words, some of them flipped back to Trump when Trump was on the ticket and went down ballot, voted for a Republican in the House. Some of them, that's not the explanation. So I think in part of these places, we can say there were some down ballot coattails for Trump. And then that doesn't explain every race by a long shot. And I think, before we get into sort of some of the blame game here, everybody likes to externalize when you lose. You like to figure out who you can point a finger at. I've learned that lesson well from my kids. Look, I think there's a lot to be said for thinking about the way that elections are run. And, it takes deep investment in grassroots organizing and community building for the long term to have a sustainable movement for change. And it takes really connecting with voters. And we know this was a tough cycle, and people aren't saying this as much, but it was hard the door knocking was compromised in some ways by the pandemic, right? And I sometimes don't see that reported. That's a reality I don't think, we've talked about as much. It is really important to be having these conversations with voters. And I think sometimes we get stuck in this mindset, and the consultants, and, I'm a former candidate and, ran for a year and a half. There's a big consultancy complex, right? The consultant industrial complex, right? That encourages money to go toward TV, toward polling, and toward mail. And those are the three big spends in a campaign, right? And so how do we think differently about elections in terms of best practices being actually spending on organizing, right? And spending on, and that's even within field programs within campaigns, and organizing in terms of spending on community groups. And I want to shout out Dorian Warren here, who just made this point this morning at a Nation event, you know, that really follow the money in terms of where the spend is going in elections, and we need to think differently. AOC has said the same thing about digital, which is a little different point, you know, that we are really getting beat, or that Democrats are really getting beat on digital by Republicans. So I think there are a number of different, you know, explanations here, and there's not sort of, you know, one reason. The other thing I just want to throw out there that is also getting underreported is that we added about 8 progressives to the House Democratic caucus. So, you know, we have Cori Bush coming in from Missouri. We have Jamal Bowman. We have Kai Kahele, Maria Leger Fernandez. You know, a lot of really exciting, Richie Torres. You know, these are names I'm sure, you know, probably a lot of you were giving to these folks, and they won. And they are really exciting progressives to watch out for, who are going to be joining the Progressive Caucus in the House. So that's actually going to increase the strength of progressives. And it's an underreported fact, but a really important one right now.
Yeah, super. I mean, that's the kind of nuanced answer I think we need with election results like this. And let me just go a little further to the hot button that probably you're living in the middle of, since you are at the intersection of outside movements and members of Congress, which is defund the police and socialism were what lost us the election. That's kind of the caricature of the debate that's happening. What do you make of that? And Abigail Spanberger famously attacked the movement left for those things, you know, making a lot of moderate Dems lose. AOC responded with some of the points that you made. Yeah, anything else to add on that debate?
Yeah, well, thanks for going right to the hot button. Yes, at the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, we are at the heart of working with activists, and we also do a lot of advocacy before Congress. So, you know, we do get to be in a lot of these conversations. I mean, look, in some ways, I feel like it's opposite day, because when we say, you know, defund the police, lost an election, you know, what we're doing in some ways is erasing the work that the Black Lives Matter movement did to galvanize a new generation of voters, right? And bring, you know, a whole new set of folks out to become civically engaged, and frankly, to put racial justice on the ballot as an issue for the entire American electorate. I mean, this election, both racial justice and white supremacy were on the ballot. That's just true, right? And so, you know, we have this incredible movement, you know, that is not just, you know, that's in cities all across the country, that has managed to bring out new voters, to bring more people into caring about their communities, and a multiracial coalition for racial equity. So that's kind of, I think, the first point that just needs to be said. You know, and then again, I think it's worth saying, look, there are always going to be attacks levied against candidates, and I remember when I ran in 2018, there was some ad that ran against me, and a newspaper, a local newspaper, decided to rate it for Pinocchios, and it was either 9 out of 10 Pinocchios or 4 out of 5 Pinocchios. Like, the thing being true is that my name is Liz Watson, you know. And then the ad ran for, I don't know, 4 weeks, 6 weeks on TV with, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars behind it. This is what happens in elections, is that, you know, there are attack ads. And the question is, what are we actually doing? What are the folks who are running doing to connect with voters? What are they doing to talk about the desperation that people are feeling? You know, people have lost family. I mean, and I say that, and I want to stop on this call and say, it could be that that's true for many of you. People are losing their loved ones. People are not able to say goodbye to them in nursing homes. Healthcare workers are going to work every day, having to fear getting sick, leaving, trying to figure out what to do about kids who are out of school. And that's just the pandemic, that we've seen that we've known about since March, right? But there's a pandemic that preceded all of this, which is the pandemic of economic inequality, the pandemic of systemic racism, the pandemic of a climate crisis, right? And we need to figure out how it is that we are making sure that we're connecting with voters, that we're offering a real prescription for change that can knit together a multiracial coalition to defeat fascism and autocracy at the ballot. And that's on us. And I think, before we go pointing fingers and casting blame, it requires anyone who wants to do that to kind of look deeply within themselves and think about how to do things differently. And so let me ask you, because I know you have also thought a lot about this issue. When you think about defund the police and its political implications, Deepak, you're someone who's deeply steeped in organizing, in community. I know I get, if you don't get Deepak's weekly missives that he sends out on email, you should sign up because they are fabulous. I know you were out in the streets in New York protesting with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so what do you think, not just about defund the police, but about what Black Lives Matter and the movement for change has contributed to our political discourse?
Yeah, I think your point about the need for positive program from Democrats, right? Not just we are not Trump, but here's how the material realities of your life will change, and that being a persuasive and compelling case. We won despite, for the most part, people having very little sense of what Joe Biden would do as president. You knock on a door, literally, okay, he's not Trump, what next? So I think that is actually a core piece of the losses. The other thing, which is maybe the deeper point about this, is since 9/11, there has been a huge increase in the scale and scope of the national security state in the country. We spend hundreds and hundreds times more on immigration enforcement than we do to enforce the minimum wage, to enforce fair housing, to enforce anti-discrimination laws, like hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times more money. And all of that spending has created a constituency of corporations who profit from the caging of other human beings, and thousands and millions of workers who are now employed by the security state. And so I kind of would put it the other way around, that I think that reducing funding for policing, incarceration, immigration enforcement is essential to the Democrats' electoral prospects long term, because this constituency is growing and growing and growing in the country. You saw it here in New York and Staten Island, Long Island. I think that's a big part of what happened in South Texas, and some of the losses was. So that's just another way in which I think the movement for Black Lives is right. The last thing I'll say, though, is, on the right, the movement and electeds do a dance with each other, and they do that dance better than we do. So I don't think we should expect marginal Democrats to say defund the police. They've got to run to 50+1. And similarly, movement's job is to expand the Overton window, right? To make it possible to think things that we couldn't think before. So that's their job, is not to play to the median voter. And how those two sides do the dance, I still think we have a lot of work to do on our side to get that right, to get that better. So maybe let's talk for a few minutes about the appeal that Democrats make to the median voter, and what you feel like the lessons from this cycle, including media, disinformation? You kind of alluded to this. Like what did we learn about how to run a campaign that wins, that commands majorities from the cycle?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, we learned a lot about the power of deep organizing and the power of relational organizing, right? And that's work that you led, you know, at Community Change, and we learned about the importance of investing in organizations that are doing that work, and making those investments for the long term. I mean, it's really easy to get kind of sucked into candidates. It's easy, and of course, you know, I mean, I'll be the first to say, you know, candidates absolutely need support, right? But you know, to sort of dip in and dip out of a state or a region based on a particular candidate and their charisma, right? But what we need in terms of turning the tide is frankly long-term sustained investment. And you know, I've thought some about state parties in also in addition to community-based organizations that are doing that organizing. And you know, so I'm from Indiana, and you know, there's not, you know, it's a long game right there, and there's not enough money, you know, for the local county parties. We have over 90 counties in Indiana. You know, not enough money for these counties to have any real infrastructure that exists for more than you know, a month before the election. And it was so fascinating to me to see really a month or two before the election, a storefront for the county party open on the town square in a lot of these little towns. The storefront would open, they'd have a ribbon cutting, it was beautiful. Everyone was so excited to have had the money to, you know, and you got to know rents are not a lot in these Indiana town, you know, to rent a little bit of space, you know, a couple hundred square feet, to have that county party, and then to be able to, you know, start the organizing, to get people to go out and knock on doors, and, you know, to have the you know, chili cook-off and all the different things that were happening, you know, a month before the election, 2 months before the election. That's just not going to cut it, right? So I think we also have to think, and I know this gets back to Howard Dean and the 50-state strategy, right? But what does it really mean to invest for the long term in local party infrastructure, right? And that means, like, you know, in a lot of places, folks can't afford to volunteer. The idea of having a full-time volunteer running a county party and out there, you know, getting the canvases going, it's just not a reality, right? In working class towns across America. So what would it look like to have enough money to pay somebody, right, to operate it, that little county party all year round and do all the work, to recruit good candidates, to do the organizing, to ally, you know, and with community organizations, and figure out those connections, so that we can actually build power. And so that's something that I think, you know, I just wanted to inject into the conversation, because we often kind of miss that when we do our I don't want to say autopsies, but you know, our look backs at how things have gone. I think that's work that needs to happen if we're going to reach the median voter. To disinformation, this is a really hard thing, Deepak. What do we have? You know, 40% of voters, I think, are getting their information from Fox News, which just has, you know, so much of America in its clutches. And what's interesting is when you look at, and that's Republican voters, when you look at Democratic voters, they aren't getting their news from one source. They get their news from a range of sources. And Fox News, you know, I mean, there's been a ton of research this year, is extremely correlated with folks having, you know, just severe levels of disinformation about how the coronavirus is spread, thinking it's nothing worse than the flu, that you don't need to worry about it, right? And so what do we do about that? You know, how do we push back on that? I think that's a really important question. And I, you know, I sort of raised the question. I don't think that I have the solution, but it's an incredible problem. So So, I think you mentioned all the work that you did in Philadelphia this cycle. I think it would be helpful for folks here to hear a little bit more about, at the doors, what you were learning, whether what you learned makes you hopeful. Tell me what you learned about what we should do differently.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to emphasize this point that you made about, I feel like a lot of fundamentals are being created by independent grassroots groups and independent political infrastructure, and they now need to migrate back into politics. Like a lot of, progressives campaigns do use those tools, but most political campaigns are still out of like, the 1970s or 1950s or something. So I feel like that's a really fundamental thing. I mean, I think we learned the Analyst Institute is the kind of premier institution that studies voter contact. And this cycle, I feel like it really confirmed, and my own experiences confirmed, person-to-person contact and contact in social networks is the gold standard, even more so in a misinformation, disinformation environment. A couple things I'd add to that, though, are I really think this kind of conventional wisdom that African American or Latino or any other group of voters is a base voter that should not be treated like a persuasion voter. I think we just have to stop that, because it results in kind of a certain segment of white middle class voters getting this very rich year-round kind of treatment and attention. And then I think the conversation at the doors in poor communities of colors is getting harder and harder and harder every cycle. I remember, like many of you probably do, door knocking in the Obama years. And it was like, you might as well have been greeted by a marching band when you showed up at the door. People are like, yes, that's the best thing ever. I'm totally there. How do I sign up? This time was like the root canal version of door-to-door work. It was like, I don't want to be here. You don't want to hear from me. Nobody wants to do this, but we're going to do this. It was like that kind of thing. And we got to deliver for people, because I think we're wearing out the rap that things are going to get better. Things actually do have to get better at some point for it to be persuasive. And yeah, and then the last thing, which everybody knows, voting is super hard. It is super confusing. And, we need to fix that in every way that we can, local and federal, like as a top priority. It is crazy what we are asking our neighbors to do, what we're asking ourselves to do to vote. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with that. And I think, a winner this cycle for sure is vote at home. And I am really convinced that we need to make sure that in every state in the country, no excuse, absentee voting, vote at home is always available everywhere. I'm from the state where the polls closed the fastest. So Indiana was the first Republican state to go, get called for Trump because the polls closed at 6 o'clock. It's crazy making, right? Because we know that there are folks who work schedules that don't allow them to get to the polls, and that these are disproportionately workers in hourly jobs who have very little control over when they work, right? And this is a way of suppressing poor people's vote, to have poll hours and locations, scarcely available to folks who don't have a lot of leisure time. So I think vote at home, I just want to make a huge plug I think that's one of the winners from the election cycle. And I know in California, you guys have been doing it forever. You already know this. Like in so many things, California led the nation, and we all need to follow on this one. Okay, so now that voters have decided and clearly delivered a win for Joe Biden, I want to ask you, Deepak, there's these conversations about a coup. What do you make of all of that?
Yeah, I was part over the summer of these interesting conversations a friend put together with the Transition Integrity Project of prominent Republicans and Democrats to war game whole variety of scenarios, so the Lincoln Republican people were part of it, and John Podesta was part of it, and Bill Kristol was part of it, and et cetera. And on almost every scenario, the Democrats lost when Trump tried to steal the election. because they were much more savage and competent than we were. Our moves were like, we will see you in court. Their moves were, bring out the tanks, so what do you think happened? So the good news is we're dealing with the Four Seasons total landscaping version of a coup, right? I mean, if it was closer and if he was remotely competent and if Rudy Giuliani was not his lawyer and on and on and on, I think the danger is very, very real. I mean, a majority of Trump voters believe the election was not legitimate. And I feel like we're going to have a very long hangover about this, because governing a country when your opposition does not concede the legitimacy of your election, that is, in our recent history, that is a very new problem. It's not a new problem, I mean, in the history of the country. It is not a new problem in terms of the rest of the world. We have not done that. And I feel like the way that mainstream Democrats have governed has presumed a whole set of conditions that basically no longer applies. So I don't think the coup is going to succeed. I do think Joe Biden will be in the White House on January 20th. But that doesn't mean the damage is not really, really profound and lasting. And we're going to need a strategy for it. So I'm curious for you, as you think about this governing problem, which is not a small problem, how do progressives approach the problem of governing in 2021? Should we be, here's my, what is Liz going to answer to the question? Should we go big or should we be super cautious and mild and moderate? Liz, what do you think? Should we be super cautious and mild and moderate?
I wish I were full of surprises, but I am not going to agree with the super cautious approach. Look, we are facing just existential threats, yes, to our democracy, and also to people's lives. And, the kinds of problems we're facing, they're crises, and nobody disagrees with that, right? So we need solutions at the scale of the problem. And one of the other lessons from this election, and I know it wasn't, I know there's a nuanced story to be told in California, but one of the other lessons to be learned in some places in this election is that big ideas did win at the ballot box. So $15 minimum wage, paid parental leave, a wealth tax, right? I loved it. I think it was the exit polling on election night where Fox News put up was it 72% of Americans wanted a, government healthcare plan, right? So there is actually a lot of support among voters for these kinds of solutions. And frankly, we need to demand them right now. And we can't wait even until Biden is inaugurated. I mean, when I say right now, I mean like right now. Because look, December 31st, we have all of these programs that were passed in terms of relief by the Congress that are now expiring. We have people who are going to be evicted. We have people who are going to be without any unemployment benefits, millions, right? Unless we immediately pass another relief package of really substantial proportion, trillions. And that is what we need to do. And the lesson that we learned from the last recession is that what going too small means is that you try to get back to where you were for over a decade. So if we don't have, a serious infusion of cash right now to help folks who are suffering, we are just going to prolong the pain and the desperation for a very long time. So I think, the lesson for this moment is that progressives, both in terms of executive action, right, need to be out there calling for what we need. And there's a lot that can be done. And, a lot of these things we know, Biden has already said, the re-entering the Paris Agreement, DACA, ending the travel ban, I was just looking at an op-ed that Elizabeth Warren just penned around lowering prescription drug prices, debt cancellation, $15 minimum wage for federal contractors, we don't have an OSHA standard in place to help people who are essential workers not get coronavirus when they go to work. We need a safety and health standard. Sorry. putting in place a task force around really looking at racial equity, declaring a state of climate emergency that would unlock resources, right? Those are all things we can do through executive action. But we also need to hold McConnell's feet to the fire. And this is where organizers come in big time. I mean, both in terms of pressing for the movement moment we need with the executive, but also pressing Mitch McConnell. Look, we know that Republicans want to destabilize our labor unions because when our labor unions are strong, we have a stronger democracy. We have, a stronger coalition of working class people voting for the kinds of changes we need, right? And we know Republicans don't want that. We need to demand labor law reform from Mitch McConnell. We need to get, folks need to sit in his office, and insist on the kinds of investments we need in our care infrastructure, in childcare, in elder care. There's so much that needs to happen in jobs and a green economy. And, he cannot be let off the hook. So I guess I would say no matter what happens in Georgia, it is on the organizing community to bring it to the Congress and to bring it when working with the Biden administration to get good things done for the country. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in the interest of getting to the questions, which I think are going to go where we were going to go anyway, I'm going to maybe take us to the last couple of pieces here of the agenda. First of all, to say, I think your point, one thing to learn from how the Republicans met Obama was they didn't say, oh, we can't get anything done. We're going to put our tail between our legs. And, they mobilized the Tea Party and they obstructed in Congress and then they won massive majorities. And I think there has to be, as you're saying, not this letting them off the hook for delivering to these crises, but really pushing hard. Executive action, yes, but pushing the Republicans really hard on legislation too. They shouldn't be let off the hook. I really think that's going to be a key ingredient. If we make it a self-fulfilling prophecy, we'll be in big trouble. So maybe last question for you, Liz, would be just to think about the role of organized progressives in this era, out on the streets, but also in Congress. There are new rules changes made by the Congressional Progressive Caucus itself that I find extremely exciting and I think could be revolutionary. But I'm just curious how you think all of us play our cards, as progressive donors on the streets, the members of Congress, like how do we maximize progressive change in this period? Mm-hmm. And maybe you could explain the rules that I don't actually understand, but that I'm excited about anyway.
Sure. Okay. Well, why don't I start there? So the Congressional Progressive Caucus has made some rules changes that are really designed to promote building power for the caucus and making sure that as a voting bloc, folks are able to actually wield power within the House to move progressive ideas forward. And so what that looks like is, they're coming up with a set of, if you're in the Progressive Caucus, that means you support and you need to pledge to support the following big progressive ideas, the following big progressive pieces of legislation. They're coming up with some rules around voting with the caucus a certain amount of the time so that there is that ideological coherence and that there is strength in numbers, right? And that's really, in the way that the House is structured, you got to find your friends in order to persuade and influence people, right? And so this is designed to build the strength of the caucus. And I think when we think about progressive power in this moment and building power for the progressive movement and co-governing and figuring out how it is that we work with progressives who are elected, right? Because we're starting to elect our own. We're electing organizers into positions of power in state and local legislatures, in Congress, right? Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal being, an immigrant rights organizer from Washington before she was elected to first the state legislature and then to Congress as one example, but there are many, many examples of that. but what does it mean to actually have that power to really govern in this moment? And I think we have to think about investing in and building up the power of organizations and institutions that promote people power. And so we talked about community-based organizations. We haven't really talked as much today about our labor unions, but one of the things that I'm very interested in is thinking about how we build a coalition of progressive organizations and labor unions, right? And labor unions were a big part of delivering this cycle as well. And when people are organized in unions, we do see that it changes the way that they vote, right? Because there is an opportunity for people to come together, organize together, talk to their friends, talk to their coworkers about what it means to vote for the change we need. So that means looking at things like labor law reform. It means stopping union busting. It means really stopping these attacks on what are really institutions that are at the core of people's movements, right? And that means investment. And so I think for donors, it's thinking about, if you didn't see immediate change this cycle, and I know this is a smart group of people who knows exactly what I'm talking about, in investing in communities that are changing. I mean, it's the story of what's happening, New South Rising, what's happening in Georgia, what's happening in Arizona, and yes, I'm going to say Texas. In Texas, long-term organizing, long-term infrastructure building takes long-term investment. And so I am going to plead for that. Yeah. So Deepak, do you want me to ask you another question, or do you want to?
The last question on Trumpism, and then we'll just open it up. Yeah.
Sure. So the last question, right? The question is, what do you see for the future of Trumpism? What do you think is our long-term strategy? What does a united front look like that can be effective?
Yeah, well, I think I confessed at the beginning to have some confusion about exactly how to parse the meaning of the 71 million who voted for him and what to do about it. I think the things that do seem clear to me are that your point about building permanent organization in the new American majority and not taking it for granted and leaning hard into that makes total sense. And that should be doubled down on, tripled down on, not taking people for granted, delivering for them. That seems clear. It also seems clear to me, and this is where the multiple truth thing comes in, that there are many millions of Americans with, maybe most Americans with mixed consciousness, as we'd call it, who have multiple stories that they make sense of their lives with. And Trump was very successful in activating one of those stories, and that we're going to need to recruit millions of people who did not vote for Joe Biden or didn't vote at all, or voted for Donald Trump, that we cannot have a governable country in our constitutional system with 71 million people, nearly half the electorate in that place. And so I think we're at the beginning of understanding that. I do think unionization and outside movements and a Biden administration collaborating on unionization is fundamental. White men behave very differently politically who are in unions that don't. The social science research is so clear about that. What else can we do to promote mass organization, as you're saying, outside of the labor movement, and community organizations and other formations should be a very high priority, because the more people are in community and the less they are isolated individually, the better chance we have of shaping a different kind of meaning. I think there should be some really aggressive looking at antitrust to break up the social media monopolies, which I think are playing a hugely destructive role. And that is something that can be done significantly with executive authority. So I think it's going to take a multi-pronged approach to kind of disassemble this Death Star that's built up over time. But I think the heart of it is like a sensibility of recruitment, that we're going to have to come out of our bubbles and engage people and win them over to our side over time, and by being in community with them. And there's no shortcut to that. And I think that's going to be really challenging. So I think we'll stop here, John. That was a lot, and turn it over to you for wherever you'd like to take us.
Well, thanks, Deepak and Liz. I mean, that's really interesting digging into all of these issues in a really provocative and informative way. And we do have a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts to get to. I want to start by asking Mark Smith to go ahead and ask your question, Mark.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Liz and Deepak. This has been a great conversation to listen to the two of you. And you've touched on some of what my question and concerns are, given the ideological breadth of the Democratic coalition. Our chances are the possibility of us maintaining and keeping majorities in Congress and winning majorities for the White House. I look at the Democratic Party sort of like a post-election coalition, government coalition building process in a parliamentary system, but that we have to do it before the election so that we can actually win. So I'm concerned less about organizing than I am about just the language that everyone can agree on, so that we don't have the kind of fights between AOC and Connor Lamb, because there's a big, it's such a big gap between in a party where you've got Joe Manchin on one side and Bernie Sanders on the other. How do we keep both the people and the messaging cohesive so that we can continue to win majorities and actually govern in the way that we want to govern?
Liz, do you want to take that first, or you want to go ahead? Either way. A hard question, so I'm giving it to you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Fundamentally, I mean, I think some of the reporting on this, Abigail Spanberger comments on a House caucus call that then sort of, it's really fun to seize on for the media, I think, to seize on Democrats in disarray. That's like, that's catnip for them. As opposed to Democrats from across the ideological spectrum came together and, Ilhan Omar, worked like crazy to elect Joe Biden, and so did Rashida Tlaib in Michigan. And, that's like not a story, right? So, AOC, they were part of this Biden-Sanders task force effort, to bring the party together. And I think, if you were doing unbiased reporting, I think that's actually a lot of the story of what happened before the election. Look, and I also think, and my dog has a lot of thoughts that he'd like to share, so you might hear from him too, that there's nobody that I saw in the Democratic caucus trying to tell anybody else how to run in their district, right? That's not the way. I mean, during the election, AOC didn't say to Spanberger, you have to say this, or that just didn't happen, right? So I think there's a real kind of tolerance and respect among elected Democrats for the range of different kinds of districts that there are in this country, and different ways that folks get across their message in different parts of the country. That is kind of missed in the way that this got reported in the media. I also think Republican attack ads will come that say things that, whether they're true or not, right? I mean, you just know that that's coming. You know that Republicans are going to go on TV with a huge amount of money, and they're going to poll at what they think is the most trenchant, and they're going to go after it, right? And so, whether any Democrat running ever said the thing or not, it really doesn't matter. So, Joe Biden is going to be a socialist at some point, right? Like that's, which he is not, for whoever decides to repeat that. But that's the way they do. So then what, right? That's kind of the question we have to ask, is then what? And I think the then what is what Deepak said. This, going to a door and hearing that people don't feel like there's a real message about how are you going to deliver the kind of real change in this country that is going to mean that, the 99%, are no longer struggling, right? That is going to mean that regular folks are doing okay instead of, going to work every day if they're able to in this pandemic and coming home with not enough to support their families, which is where so many people in America are. So I think we have to have a message about how we are actually going to deliver real change for real people, and that is how we defeat the noise.
I'd love to, there's several questions about, around this theme of how do we communicate effectively, to enlarge that tent, really. And I'd like to ask Weston Milliken to weigh in.
Sure, thank you for calling on me. Question that I put in the chat was, how do we advance ideas when Republicans shamelessly and perpetually outright lie? And then there's the echo chamber from Murdoch, et cetera. And Deepak knows, because we've had conversations about this, that I believe we need to have a clear messaging strategy that says what the Democrats stand for. We don't have that, so the Republicans are able to define that for us. And I think that speaks to what Liz was just saying about messaging. So I would be interested in hearing from both or one of you about that particular issue and how we move that forward in an environment where it's difficult to advance, particularly if we have to remove the filibuster, which then may come back to bite us. If we were able to get the 2 Georgia seats, we've seen how removing the filibuster on judges, for example, came back to bite us. So that's a big question, I know, but take it where you want to.
Well, I'll give you one example that really excited me this year that I think speaks to your point, Weston, which of all places is in West Virginia, which is it might have been the Trumpiest of all states this year. The highest Trump margins are close to it. So there's a longtime community organizer, Stephen Smith, who ran for governor this year and came very close to winning the Democratic primary. And he built a massive organization with a very progressive platform called West Virginians Can't Wait. And they did door-to-door mutual aid. So not what do you think about, I don't know, whatever issue, but how are you doing on healthcare? Like, what's happening in your home? Do you have a job? Like, do you have food on the table? How can we help each other as community members? And what I think was brilliant about the combining of mutual aid and politics is that the first place you can enter into somebody is if you have some kind of trust. If someone feels like you're interested in their well-being, not just because you're going to do what you want me to do, not because you it's be manipulation, but because there's some actual relationship. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the party nationally is very, very distant from people's everyday lives. It's not in the texture of people's lives. So in the absence of being in people's lives, it comes up with these little bumper stickers or little fragments, message fragments, that it kind of hurls out of Washington and hopes lands on voters.
He's right.
A mysterious process that will cause them to turn out and vote. And that's just not the way human beings operate. And so I think it's less a question of trimming the sails on message. I really don't think that's what it is, and more a question of what these independent political operations have shown us in California over the years, but also in Arizona and Georgia. And I'm hopeful that people like Stacey Abrams and Pramila Jayapal, et cetera, will kind of gain the weight in the party to show you can win and have a clear agenda. You can run on that agenda and you can actually persuade people because you're connected to them and their experience in a real way. So I think it's message and connection together, and something about platform, because I think what Liz said earlier about the disinformation ecosystem, like that also has to be part of the equation, taking that down.
So I want to bring 2 people into the conversation, and we're kind of digging into this a bit more, and I think it's important. I hope it's okay, and then we'll move to some other topics. But we want to explore this a little bit more, and I want to ask Paula Litt and then Wally Marks to join the conversation. And then for both you and Liz, Deepak, to weigh in after Paula and Wally.
So I wanted to push a little more with both Deepak and Liz on this question of what Deepak was just talking about, messaging and the united front to govern, and then also what Deepak said about how do you balance the movement demands against messaging that keeps that unity. And what I want you to address is what I see as a cultural bias from progressive, which has been a problem, in my opinion, in the Democratic Party and in the society for the last 50 years. And I think defund the police is an example of that. I don't think it's a benign demand. I think it was a very bad demand because it divided and it did not unite. And it was not winnable. And it was, for most people, not desirable, including me. I actually don't believe in defunding the police. Do I believe in all the things that people go into explaining about defund the police? Yes, but if you're in the position of having to spend 30 minutes explaining that to people, you've already lost the demand. And what I'm worried about is not that one, we don't have to beat that to death, but what we do have to talk about is what I see as this cultural bias, which is not often amongst progressive, which is not to take the route that when we're talking about governing, I'm not talking about agitating here. I'm not talking about organizing here. I'm talking about when you get to the point of governing where you're trying to get a vote or a change in a policy, you have to go to where you can win the most amount of people. And in my experience over all these years, most voting people are moderate. That does not mean they're not open to bold ideas around like a New Deal type of economy demands. It doesn't mean that you can't go for bold demands, but you have to do what Deepak just said. You have to have demands that resonate with the most people possible. And what I'm a little worried about here, particularly when Liz was talking, is we can talk about defund the police and analyze whether it was a good demand or not. And I'm finding the defensiveness about, don't point fingers, don't do that, is not going to help us move forward. What's going to help us move forward is to analyze it and say, how did it work? And I think it worked very badly.
So I guess I have a couple things to say about that.
Let me ask Wally to, bring his question in too, because I think they're related.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think if what I wrote in the chat says what my feelings are about empathy. So I would just, I could read what I wrote, or everyone can read it, but it's just, we've got 70+ million people that feel that we are not united. And, we have to make efforts to reduce that amount. And how do we get there? How do we find empathy with those that, drastically have opposing ideas?
Yeah, I'm having moments I have trouble doing that myself. So yeah, physician heal thyself, I guess, about that. Yeah, on Paula's question, I think this is fundamental to beating Trumpism. And I think there's at least a couple of layers to it. One is that John Powell talks about breaking narratives and bridging narratives, which I find a very compelling way of thinking about it. And that if our narratives are too much breaking, that is to say they polarize in such a way where there's a small minority of people against a large majority, and not enough bridging, as in we all have some common, or most of us have some common needs and desires, that that you are a part of this, then that is not a winning political program. So I do think we need more bridging messaging and more bridging inclusive policy. The second part of the answer, though, has to do with how political entities incorporate radical movements, or in some ways co-opt them. And we want them to be co-opted. So the 1930s, the communists marched in the streets around the unemployed and tenants and so forth. And Huey Long had his share of the wealth clubs, and Roosevelt developed a program that accommodated some of the concerns, but in a majority way. Same thing happened in the 60s. And part of what the Democratic Party has to figure out how to do is to take the legitimate grievance and incorporate it in a way and in a language and in a framework that actually addresses people's real problems. And that's where I think there is some failure on the Democratic Party side that feeds the militancy of the demand, because it doesn't feel like there's, Keeanga Yamahata Taylor has a great piece in the New Yorker, which was my experience in Philly. You knock on a door, people are locked up, people are poor, at risk of eviction, all things Liz said. They're democratic cities. They've been democratic for a long time. And so there's something broken in the incorporation, in the engagement, that is feeding a kind of polarization in movement that I think you're rightly referring to as politically not workable from a majority standpoint. So there's responsibility on both sides, is what I'm trying to say, for that failure. And then the last piece is, sometimes we may not agree about the ultimate destination, which is going to be true for Joe Biden and the left. That's just going to be true. But we can agree on getting to the 5th floor of the, I'm in New Yorker, right? So everything's an apartment building, right? So roofs. I know this is not an LA metaphor I'm using, right? But if you want to go up to the 5th floor and it's a 10-floor building, the left wants to go up to the 10th floor. Joe Biden's only willing to go up to the 5th floor. Well, you can do that. And you can do that together in a way that positions those constituencies to be stronger for the next go round. That requires a kind of suppleness and ability to like negotiate out with each other that has not been characteristic of either the Democrats or the left in a way that it has been of the right and the Republicans in these last couple of decades. And that's a fixable problem. Not an easy one, but that is a fixable problem.
I'll just add, and thanks, Deepak. That was, I think, a really thoughtful. I mean, this is a very hard conversation, and you know, I think one thing we need to remember here is that, you know, it is the case that social movements and movement demands are often to the left of where even the most left politicians are, right? So they're, in this case, you know, there's a set of demands that have really moved politicians to respond, right? And then the responses, I think, have been felt, you know, sometimes by the movement as inadequate, but you know, but there have been responses. So the Justice and Policing Act this year, which was a police reform bill, was actually, I think, every member of the Democratic caucus, including all of the Progressive Caucus members, supported it. It was led by the Congressional Black Caucus, and had a number of really important things that ought to happen to stop police brutality. And, you know, the movement, the fact is, if the movement hadn't been out there pushing, would, you know, it's unclear, would that have happened, right? And now there is that, you know, that line in the sand that has been drawn. So I guess, you know, it's just a very hard question. You know, what is the expectation on elected officials and on movements? Movements exist for reasons that aren't necessarily, you know, just to win elections, right? That's not, they're out there to build power. They're out there to draw attention to really critical issues. They're out there to make addressing systemic racism, you know, a primary goal of a multiracial coalition across the United States, right? And then there's elected officials and the way that they need to think and talk in order to deliver their message in a way that connects with voters. And those are two separate groups of people. And I think we tend to lump them together and you know, and it's just the fact is that on the ground, you know, you've got two separate groups of people who are operating with different goalposts, right? In terms of being able to actually garner the votes to win elections and then govern. So, that's all to say, I think electeds, their job is not to quash the movement. That wouldn't be something that they could do, nor should they, right? And so I think some of this, kind of reporting has been suggesting that it's on electeds to sort of change the way that the movement operates. And I just don't think that that's the way that we should be thinking about the relationship between movement groups and electeds.
So I'd like to ask Jenny Delwood to come in now with some thoughts on what we saw in Los Angeles and California, where there were some really interesting and relevant campaigns and results.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to build on some of what Paula and Wally asked about. I mean, I think that Los Angeles is a great example of where we won on a positive message. I know, Paula, we've talked about how Measure J, which was our racial justice ballot measure, which was the culmination of the movement in the streets to enact structural change in our county's budget to ensure that alternatives to incarceration and community development was invested in, as opposed to punishment, as opposed to cages and jails. And so we won that resoundingly with 57% of the vote, with a positive message as opposed to a defund message, but with that same movement spirit, with the same movement leaders leading the way, with grassroots organizers who were organizing in the streets, shaping the actual policy and leading the campaign. And that is also a very good Liberty Hill story. It's a story about organizers and donor activists coming together. Liberty Hill was proudly the #1 foundation funder, one of only a few foundations that went all in on Measure J. And we partnered very closely with the United Way to build a broad base of donors, but also step out of the way and really fuel and fund organizers to do their thing and bring this victory home. So we were really proud to support on a variety of things, but certainly philanthropy played a huge role in the polling to make that measure a success in the first place, in the fundraising effort, as well as in the communications. And I think that's a beautiful story of Liberty Hill, both the on the ground grassroots organizing prowess, as well as the fundraising necessary to bring home a progressive win with a short time frame, really seizing the moment of the movement in the streets, of the call to racial justice, and making it more than just a demand to defund the police, but actually a structural reform which will be with us indefinitely and will bring in millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not over $1 billion, for alternatives to incarceration moving forward. So we're really excited about that win. And I think that why that speaks to Paula and what Wally was saying is that we did try to appeal, and the organizers were really critical in shaping an empathetic message that appealed to a broad base. Additionally, Liberty Vote, as Shane mentioned at the beginning of this call today, or this Zoom, was relaunched this year in part, and in large part really, to everybody on the line, and in honor of Gary Stewart, our former board chair and beloved friend and colleague. He inspired us to reinvigorate Liberty Vote, funding grassroots community organizing. We did not fund these organizations towards the end of the year. We funded them at the beginning of the year: Cheerla Action, Community Coalition Action, Scope Action, Ground Game Los Angeles, People Power Action Fund in Long Beach. And they were able to do tremendous work, both on organizing around issues as well as organizing at the ballot box. In fact, one of our longtime community partners, Khmer Girls in Action in Long Beach, started the People Power Action Fund, put a really transformative ballot initiative on the ballot in Long Beach that we haven't talked enough about. It's called Measure US, or Measure Us, and it taxes big oil in Long Beach. And where is that money going? The money is going to youth development, to housing infrastructure, and environmental justice. So this was a really exciting win led by organizers, building a broad base of youth development organizations and environmental justice groups and environmental mainstream groups coming together to now have a funding stream in the city of Long Beach specifically for justice, as opposed and not taxing the people, but instead taxing big oil. So that's just another example of where we, Liberty Hill and the Liberty Hill donor community, fueled community organizing to seize a moment and win at the ballot. Of course, we know we did not win Schools and Communities First, even though there was significant organizing. We're not going to win them all. I think that what Schools and Communities First allowed us to do, which by the way, Liberty Hill was proudly the largest foundation funder of Schools and Communities First across California as well, small but mighty, thanks to all of you. We did win a tremendous amount of organizing infrastructure in the Schools and Communities First campaign. Just a couple of examples. The Million Voters Project, again, that was designed to bring 1 million new voters to the polls, was able to ID over 360,000 supporters. Of those, over 13,000 new volunteers actively engaged, which will become active members of community organizing groups across the state. And in addition, built an entirely new infrastructure of year-round organizing, phoning, digital organizing, text bank organizing across the state, which will be transformative to win issue campaigns, policy campaigns, and electoral campaigns moving forward. So thank you to everybody's support. I think that certainly Los Angeles, with our victories on Measure J, with electing progressives like our former board member, Holly Mitchell and George Gascon, and winning Schools and Communities First. If you look at the statewide, we lost 48 to 52, but in Los Angeles, we won 54% of the vote for Schools and Communities First. So that is a testament to the investments of donor activists and the work of organizers that we will continue to fuel moving forward. So that's a little bit of LA. I think that the LA story is absolutely critical for us to be telling and amplifying across the country. So I'd love to hear from Deepak and Liz a little bit about what you think we should be doing in terms of sharing the lessons of Los Angeles, and then also what are the things that we can learn from other places in the country to incorporate into our strategies.
You know, and could I go ahead and ask Liz Levitt Hirsch and Catherine King, who also have questions about Georgia, because I think that maybe if we expand this not just to, you know, California and Los Angeles, which we're all, you know, super involved in and important, but to think about, I think the lessons in Georgia and in Arizona and perhaps in Nevada before that, and what we can really be learning from each other. Liz and Catherine, do you want to weigh in with your?
I'd be delighted, John. I really believe that the organization Fair Fight is a model for us. The amount of registrations they were able to realize swung Georgia. And my question earlier is, how many more registrations are they able to do prior to the senatorial race? And that's where my head goes. And I feel strongly about contributing to Fair Fight.
And also there was a question about whether those newly registered 18-year-olds were going to make a difference.
Right. That's what I'm wondering, because there are a whole flock of people that turned 18. Maybe they didn't make it into the election for Biden, but maybe they are ready to be in the voter rolls for this coming senatorial race.
2 months, but yeah. Catherine, you want to add yours?
Well, I just want to say, clearly there's going to be a ton of money on both sides of this. And so some people say go fund the two guys directly, but then of course Fair Fight and the organizing. But I'm wondering if you guys happen to have an opinion as to whether we have a shot at winning one or both, or what it looks like right now, if you know anything more than anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think those races are very winnable. The polling is extremely close. Special elections, the conventional wisdom is they're better for Republicans because they're low turnout affairs. I actually think this may turn out differently because, as Liz was saying, Trump had coattails, even though he lost. He's not on the ballot. The Republicans in the state are fighting with each other at the top. And I think the infrastructure that's been built over well over a decade now has ripened and is ready for battle. So I think they are very winnable races. Liz should talk about from a congressional perspective what it means, but like it's hugely.
Well, I think, I mean, unless we get the Senate, we're going to be totally stifled by Mitch McConnell for at least 2 years and 4 years. And so, of course, the next question, what does the Senate for 2022 look like as far as who's got an advantage as far as what seats are up and this and that? And I haven't actually heard about that yet to know if there's a chance we could for sure get the Senate in 22 or not. So.
Yeah, the map in well, one last thing about Georgia is the ground operation that Stacey Abrams founded, New Georgia Project, which is the C3, and there's a C4, and there's also a PAC, remains the vehicle to do large-scale voter registration and outreach. My former organization is working closely with it on the partisan side. They are registering new voters up to the deadline of December 7th, yet including new young voters. It's got an incredible, charismatic, effective leader, Nsé Ufot. So I just want to point people who are interested in Georgia. I think it's a huge, crucial part of that infrastructure. And I think supporting that independent infrastructure that got us this far is a huge part of what should happen. The Senate map is way better. So there's Pennsylvania, it's going to be an open seat. Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is up. There'll be North Carolina will be up. There'll be a Florida seat up. So there's real possibilities to either take or build on a Democratic majority in 2022. In the Senate, I think it's all about how the governing goes up until then. Whether that's really a possibility, but it's a favorable map relative to the bias of the Senate to small population, disproportionately white and conservative states.
Liz, do you want to weigh in on that question of, what can we learn from California, and if we, might add Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and vice versa?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as Deepak just mentioned, taking the Georgia example, the organizing that happened this cycle started long before this cycle in those states. And, I think in Georgia, at least a decade in the making. And so, I think one of the things we learn is the long game, which we've discussed here, and not, to try to avoid, just only chasing the win and in terms of, most votes cast in a particular election, but to really think about building power for the long term. And then I just want to say, as somebody who, so I am a policy person. I'm not really a elections pontificator, but this has been fun. But on the policy side of things, that the wins that have happened in California for a very long time have really, for progressives, I mean, we look to California when we think about, what are the policies that we ought to be trying to push at the federal level. And so, and I work in the field of labor and employment. So, I'll just take the wins around predictable scheduling for people working in hourly jobs. I've referred to that and how that makes it hard to go and cast your vote. It makes it hard to do a lot of things, right? San Francisco was the first city ever to have a predictable scheduling ordinance. You all have led on paid family leave. You've led on combating wage theft. You've led on promoting worker organizations. So there's, a lot of good that you all are doing by supporting. I guess that's to say, when you invest in supporting these kinds of measures that pass, whether at the municipal level or at the state level, there is a nation that is watching. and learning from the California experience. And I know this cycle it wasn't uniformly it wasn't uniformly positive, and there were some real losses too that you all have shared with me. But keep pushing, because you make a difference for Californians, but you make a difference for the nation.
I'd like to ask Marie Kennedy to come in with her question now.
Well, it was actually Chris Tilley's question. But so go ahead.
So I actually wanted to turn the discussion to Republican counter moves. And in particular, there's been a bunch of, one of the currents in the Republican Party is this sort of Marco Rubio, Orrin Cass, what really works about Trumpism is the working class appeal. So let's be serious about appealing to the working class. Let's talk about common good capitalism. Let's do a bunch of pro-worker reforms, possibly even work with unions while trying to limit and co-opt them, while keeping the social conservative, anti-immigrant, a bunch of the other baggage. And let's basically pull that Democratic base out from under them. And I'm curious how seriously you guys take that and how we should respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think Liz, was it Josh Hawley who introduced a version of the amazing bill Pramila did about how to keep workers employed and get income? They didn't coordinate it, but he's an example of that kind of thinking. I mean, at the moment, I have to say the Republican playbook nationally is not to win people over through some new policy mixture. It's to prevent people from voting. I mean, that's the playbook, right? It's a very anti-democratic, small d democratic playbook. I thought there was a very dangerous play that Trump had before him of kind of an ethno-nationalist populism to manifest in policy of, what would be called the Herrenvolk populism, kind of working class benefits, but very exclusionary and racist at its core. They have not pursued that in actual implementation, although there's a lot of ferment about that. Ross Douthat and all these kind of conservative intellectuals have been preaching it, but it's been big business, deregulation, and more of the same policy-wise for the most part, with the exceptions of some stuff on trade and obviously immigration. But there hasn't been a lot on working class delivery. So I don't know, Liz, from your vantage point, whether you feel like there's actually stuff happening in Congress and that has been, or?
I do not think that Republicans are delivering for the working class. I will say, I think it is interesting to think about, Donald Trump really ran, as you were saying, Deepak, on, this pack of lies about, that somehow he had gold toilets and was going to be the savior for the working class. I mean, it was just bizarro land, right? But he ran on that and there was nothing there. At some point, I decided to catalog everything he'd ever said about whether he would raise the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour, what it is still, I think, in 21 states across the country. And he had said everything there is to say. I mean, he said, yes, I will, no, I won't, I'll raise it to this, I'll raise it to that, and just, spewing the disinformation. He is actually the source of a lot of the disinformation that floats out there. It is scary that on the thin veneer of messaging, there are some folks who seem to be compelled by that. So I guess, Deepak, maybe I'll differ with you a little bit, that I think there's no there. I think the emperor has no clothes. I think Republicans have no plan to actually deliver for working class voters. But I do find it scary that there's a certain appeal of, let's blow up Washington, and that somehow, is something that folks listen to. Hold on one second. We have some, mommy's on a Zoom, so just letting you know. So
life in the pandemic, yes.
Life in the pandemic. I think that what we need to think about is how are we making sure that what it is that that Democrats frankly stand for, that is actually connecting with voters. And I really resonated, Deepak, with what you said about mutual aid, right? First, establishing relationships of trust, right? And then actually having a conversation about, the difference that it can make to elect good people, the difference it can make to rebuilding our democratic institutions, the difference it can make to rebuilding union strength, which leads to a much stronger middle class, raising wages, investing in our infrastructure, investing in a green economy and good green union jobs, investing in childcare. There's so much, restoring the overtime rule that Obama, the minimum wage for the middle class. There's so much that can actually be done. Are we connecting with voters in a way that they believe that's going to happen from electing certain people? That's less clear, and I think that is because those relationships of trust are frayed and they're not as strong as they could be. I did some in my personal capacity, I did some calls, that's my personal hat, this cycle, where I had some conversations talking about, I remember talking to an undecided voter and I said, well, what matters to you? And it turned out childcare mattered a lot. Having a $15 minimum wage mattered a lot. And I said, well, these are actually things that only one of the candidates has said he'll deliver on and the other one won't, And the person on the other end of the line said, but how do I know that's true? Politicians say everything there is to say. I don't necessarily believe any of it, right? And so what does it mean to be believed? What does it mean to have a politics of trust? And I think it means delivering results, which is, frankly, we know going to be hard if it's Mitch McConnell obstructing. And we're going to have to use every tool in the toolbox that we have to do that. And it means the deep work organizing in communities. It means both.
Deepak, I know you said in the chat that you wanted to say a few more words about empathy, and that seemed, we've got some great questions that down, details about the eligible voters who don't vote, about redistricting, gerrymandering, and about changes that are needed at the DNC. And I'm hoping that we can maybe forward those questions to both of you and see if we can connect, the answers to the folks who are asking them. But with the time that we have, just sort of wanted to give you a chance to say what you want to say about empathy, which it seems to be a thread that has run through this conversation this morning, this afternoon, and then hand it back over to Shane Goldsmith to bring us home.
Well, I think that one of the main things I wanted to make sure to say is that, yes, there was this massive polarity in the electorate in terms of Trump and Biden. But if you go underneath that, the vast majority of people in the country on both sides of Trump and Biden are not actually ideologues at all and do not hold consistent views about any topic whatsoever. And so it's very hard for those of us who like to think that we have consistent views about the world to sort of relate to the messiness of that reality, but it's really the truth. And so if you believe that to be the case, then the importance of what Liz was saying about having positive program, that is to say, not letting the last association, whether it's be defund the police or whatever other thing that pops up through disinformation on social media come through, having a positive message that's welcoming and open and sustainable is one piece of the puzzle. The second piece of the puzzle is not to sort of write off huge segments of the country or huge segments of the populace, because really we haven't tried. We're not actually engaging with people in a granular way day to day with large numbers of people. And there's been all this research this year about relational canvassing, relational voter outreach, work around immigration to lower the charge of anti-immigrant bias. And it has shown that authentic, real communication between human beings, surprise, reduces the level of animus and hatred and openness, it does require the person who's doing that work to also be willing to be changed by what you see and hear too. So I guess it's it's kind of like, we do have to defeat the fascists, right? And they're not gone. This is true. And it's also true that we have to meet this messy, messy political reality with a kind of open heart and patience that I don't always live up to, but I should be held accountable to, and the rest of us should too, I think.
Well, thank you, and thanks to everybody for joining in. Just very heartfelt and useful and pragmatic conversation this morning. Shane, you want to bring us home?
Yes, thank you. And I'll take the CEO privilege, and I really appreciated Barbara Cohen's question there. And we talked a lot about anti-Black racism and white supremacy in the prep. And so I would actually like to have you both address that. It is obviously one of the biggest things happening here and the scariest things to combat. So maybe you could both just jump in on that one, and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, it's the whole backdrop, front drop, side drop, round the corner drop. The whole of our politics has been driven by this sense of who belongs, who is us. It is the defining axis of our political life. And I don't think the forces that have been reinvigorated by Trump, he didn't cause them, they were there beforehand, he has given them, put more fuel on the fire, are going to go anywhere anytime soon. And I don't think that there's any possibility of getting to a progressive place in this country without some real reckoning about race. There's kind of this debate in the Biden administration about healing, and at one level I am for healing, but the thing that there cannot be an alighting of is there has to be an accounting of racial harms, past and present, and an open dialogue in the country about them if we're ever going to get to a different place. And I don't see another path. It can be done skillfully, it can be done less skillfully, but it has to happen. It's the indispensable condition for getting to a different kind of politics in this country. And not just conversation, actual repair.
So systemic racism, I think, is the tool that is deployed to divide us in this country, is deployed, was deployed very successfully by Trump in 2016, and frankly pretty successfully again, given how many votes were cast. And I'm not saying that every single vote for Trump was because of that, but it was used very, very effectively. And the reality is, if we are going to be able to form in this country a multiracial, class-conscious coalition that has solidarity and hangs together to vote for the things that we all need, and as Deepak said, I think we've been in a number of conversations this week, one of them, and that where we are going to realize that we all do better. When we all do better, we are not going to get there until we address systemic racism. Right? Because that is the tool that is used to divide us. That is the tool that is used to get people to vote against the things that are actually in their interest. It is a huge problem that it is the foundational problem of our nation. It preceded Trump. It was part of the birth of this country, the original sin. And if we are going to have a politics that is about trust, it's going to be a politics that actually reckons with that fact. And I do want to end on a hopeful note. I think what has happened over the course of this year, despite pandemic, right, despite all of the terrible hardships that so many people are facing, is that a multiracial coalition has risen up, led by Black women, to actually confront racial injustice and to fight for racial equity, and we saw in the exit polls, we saw voters saying racial equity was very much, a preeminent thing that people had in their minds as they went to the ballot box. So we are seeing the movement actually precipitate and bring about this change. And we need to keep fighting for it. And until we do it, we are not going to be able to achieve that politics that we all hope for, which is a politics of solidarity, of multiracial solidarity.
Excellent, thank you. So glad we ended on that note. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If we were in person, there'd be a roaring applause, I know, for Deepak and Liz. I'm sorry that you don't get to enjoy that, but know that it's, yes, we can do it visually. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's really just exactly the discussion we wanted to have. And thank you, John, too, for wonderfully leading the Q&A. So a few takeaways for me, number one is really that Trumpism 2.0 is going to be a lot worse than the original. And so we better deliver terrifying and true. Number two, the real need for a positive program with good messaging that is really about changing realities for everyday folks. And then again, actually delivering. Number three, that we're not going to heal without an accountability and a reckoning on racism, and just acknowledging the power of racism as a tool to divide and oppress us. And number four is don't take any voters for granted. I think that was really critical. And I think we saw that in California and Los Angeles as well. And I think that was a lot of what surprised folks is like, okay, wow, we're even more divided here than we thought. And I think the importance of not taking voters of color for granted, low-income folks, and even Angelenos for granted. And I think that really points to the power and importance of organizing in Los Angeles and California, both to keep ourselves united and to keep us on the cutting edge, but also to continue to put forward progressive programs and policies that can be a model for others, as we often talk about. And finally, on the hopeful note, is really acknowledging what an extraordinary feat it is to defeat an authoritarian president. Let's not underestimate how incredibly difficult that is and what a tremendous accomplishment it is. And that we did, while doing that, we built power across the nation here in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and that it was led by a multiracial coalition with a united front of folks leading with racial justice as a core issue. And these are tremendous successes and a lot to build on for the future. So thank you for lifting all that up. I want to share that on December 9th, our next event, you're all invited to our Music as a Vehicle for Social Change event, where we'll have our good friend John Densmore, a drummer for the Doors, talking about his book, where he interviewed folks like Janis Joplin, Bob Marley, Jim Morrison. John's been a longtime donor and friend to Liberty Hills, and he'll be interviewed by Melinda Newman, who's our board member and recently won a big award at the Country Music Awards. So that's December 9th. Look in your email for that invite. And then finally, with a call to action, we just got 2 quick calls to action, which should be up on your screen. Give to Liberty Vote, or to our grantees or to grantees locally right here in Los Angeles. You can do that on our website, and support local and regional groups in Georgia. And if you're interested in who to support and how to vet organizations, our own Sarah Vale, our director of philanthropy, is doing a ton of research looking at what's really the good grassroots work in Georgia, and she's happy to help you make those decisions about where to give to. So with that, I will thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and I will see you again soon. Bye.